Hello, it's Mr. Wood here. Welcome to our fourth video in our series on Theme D, Religion, Peace and Conflict. This lesson is all about reasons for war. Our objectives today are to understand three main causes of war: greed, self-defense and retaliation. We're also going to be understanding religious responses to these reasons. Now, what do you need to know today? You need to know that all wars have a complicated array of reasons behind them. However, often their causes are led by things like greed, self-defense and retaliation. While some religious people agree with wars to defend a country, very few would agree with wars that were caused because of greed or retaliation. Now we're just going to start by thinking about why. If you ask why did this happen about any major event in history, you would know that there's a whole array of different factors that led to them. You'd never see a question in a history paper that says this: what caused the Second World War? 1 mark. Because you know as well as I do that there are a huge array of contributing factors that led to World War II, not just one. And it would be foolish to say that there was just one reason or one cause behind war. In the same way, we're going to look at today three contributing factors that might lead to a war. However, you need to be aware that actually wars are way more complicated than just narrowing it down to one reason most of the time. So our first type of reason for war we're thinking about today is greed. And greed is essentially wanting more than you have already. One of the 10 commandments is do not covet, which basically means that, God has given you all this good stuff and this is enough for you and you can be content with this. Don't spend your life just wishing you had a different life or wishing you had more than what God has graciously given you. It's a great message in 2020 to think about greed, because through the media, through adverts, we're often tempted to desire more than we have, and we can often find ourselves unhappy in who we are and with what we've got because we're desperate for what other people have. Jesus did some great teaching about this. In the book of Luke, he says this: watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions, which basically means, be careful, guys. It's easy to fall into the trap of greed, but actually what you want to do is learn to be content with what you've got, because there's more to life than stuff. And a very famous quote about greed comes from St. Paul in his letter to Timothy. He writes this: for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. This is often misquoted by students who say that money is the root of all evil. That's not what Paul is saying here. He's saying the love of money can lead to great evil. And when we're thinking about war, this quote is particularly helpful. Because if you think about how many people might die in a war, if a country's gone to war for money or oil or more land, you could argue that these are awful and evil things, purposes for war, when there are people's lives at risk. And in any war, you're going to have lots of people dying, not just soldiers, but civilians too. So for the majority, now I'd say all religious people, especially all Christian people, they would say that a war fought for greed would be a wrong reason, would be an evil reason. Our second reason for war is self-defense, and I'm sure that makes total sense to you, that if a country is attacked by another country and they fight back to defend themselves, then that is effectively a war. Now, interestingly, in the whole of the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Paul, there's not one quote that really backs up the idea of self-defense. However, throughout the Bible, there's lots that talk about defending others. And as we've spoken about in previous lessons, that justice is really important to God, and defending people who can't defend themselves is really, really important to God. And there's lots of teachings about this in the Bible. Here's a great one from Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17. It says, learn to do right and seek justice. Goes on to say, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow. Now, these are all people who can't fight for themselves. And many religious people would understand this verse to say that it's acceptable to fight on behalf of those who are vulnerable and who cannot fight for themselves. And so for many Christians and many religious people, a war for the purpose of self-defense would be acceptable. The third and final reason for war is retaliation, is getting payback. This one's a little bit complicated because different religious people have different views about this. There's a classic quote here from Jesus, which you probably know, where Jesus says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. And if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Effectively, turn the other cheek. If someone hits you, do not retaliate. Turn the other cheek. Now, some Christians would take this quote and they would say that then retaliation if your country's been attacked from another country is wrong. You should turn the other cheek. Other Christians would say, well, no, actually, what Jesus is saying here applies to two people. So if it's one person and they've been, slapped, not to slap back, they would say it's not right to take that principle and apply that to country when a country has the responsibility to protect its citizens. It's a really interesting one, retaliation. There was, after the September 11th, the war on terror started, and America and some other nations, fought back in a sense to get retaliation for the attacks on the two towers. And lots of Christians had different things to say about that, but some were very unsupportive. They did not support it, they didn't condone it, because they felt that retaliation is not a loving thing to do and wasn't the right thing to do in that situation. Other Christians would say that diplomacy is the most important thing. Then rather to retaliate, you build relationships and you talk through the issues so they can be resolved. Here's another quote from the book of Deuteronomy that's also quoted in the New Testament. God says, "It is mine to avenge and I will repay." And Paul talks about this later in the Bible as well, this very same verse. He basically says, don't take revenge, you leave it to God. So some Christians would say it's not right to retaliate. You need to leave revenge in God's hands. You focus on being loving your neighbor, being kind, and praying about the situation. So time to check your understanding. If you could pause the video here, have a go at these questions, and then when you're ready, unpause it and we'll talk about the answers. Okay, answer time. So question number 1, explain how the following factors can lead to war. So greed. So greed could lead to war if a country wants more possessions, more power, more land, more control over oil, that sort of thing. That can lead to a war. Self-defense. If a country is attacked and they fight back to defend themselves, to protect their citizens, then that can lead to a war. And retaliation. If a country's been attacked by another country and then responds by attacking that country back, that will also lead to a war. Number 2, for the above reasons for war, explain your opinion on which is the most acceptable reason down to the least acceptable. Give reasons for your answers. Well, hopefully you've had a good chance to think about your own opinion on that. I mean, many people would say that the most acceptable of these is self-defense. It's very understandable. If you're responsible for looking after your country and you're attacked by someone else, that you would want to defend those people and make sure they're protected. And some would say that the least acceptable, and again this is your own opinion, is greed. That it's not right to use greed as a reason to put people's lives in danger. Number 3, a Christian would never support a war because of retaliation. Now this is an interesting question because the war we mentioned earlier, the war on terror, some Christians supported it and some didn't. And this is a theme you're going to see in this GCSE, and it's a way of thinking you need to get into your head. So when you answer a question like this, you need to say, well, some Christians, they think this, and other Christians, they think this. What I think is this, and then give your own personal opinion based on what you've read. But some Christians would, and some Christians wouldn't. And part of it, you could say that retaliation for some is a form of self-defense, in that it's looking at the bigger picture. If you've been attacked by another nation and you don't retaliate, are you then leaving yourself open to further attacks? And that's one argument that some people make. So your extension there was to research 3 wars and what caused each one. I hope you got on well with that. So that is the end of our lesson there on reasons for war. Hopefully by the end now, we'll look back at that need to know, and you'll know this, that all wars have a complicated array of reasons behind them. However, often the causes, when you boil them down, are because of greed, self-defense, or retaliation. While some religious people agree with wars to defend a country, few would agree with wars that are fought for greed or retaliation. Hope that was helpful today. Looking forward to seeing you next time.